it's funny because like the movie is like autobiographical in some very specific ways. My kid plays my kid. The house the characters visit is my family's house from before the war. But like, it's funny, I feel that's not very personal. Those things were kind of like details along the way and along the process. The things that are really personal in the movie to me are like me talking about basically just the, I don't know, discomfort, struggles I've had in male relationships, basically in friend relationships. In this case, it's a cousin, but it can be a friend. And just feeling completely envious of somebody whose life you know is materially and unsustainably much worse than yours. But just this deep feeling of envy and shame about being this self-conscious, just this, this self-conscious, constantly questioning, anxious person. And Kieran, for me, is kind of like he's like my id. He's like, my shadow, this guy who is so comfortable with himself, even to the point where he's comfortable talking about his own grief in a way that feels more earthy and rich than the way I talk about my own grief. And at the same time, I know that he has this unsustainable life, and I just can't reconcile these two things, this great person and this person who's been hollowed out. And so that stuff is really personal. And for me, I'm sitting there in the library writing it, and I'm like, crying over writing it, and then I'm acting, and it just feels like this almost like cathartic thing of all the stuff I've been feeling about certain things that I haven't been able to articulate, but that I can through when I'm writing, because it feels like there's this bit of a separation. And then acting for me has always been this really cathartic thing, and so for me to get to kind of like bring that to fruition through performing it felt really cathartic, but ultimately completely unhelpful. I'm still stuck in those feelings, but maybe in some ways it's good to exercise it.
That's interesting. And Payal,
it's a beautiful scene.
It really is, right?
Thank you. Whoa.
Payal, what for you was the scene?
There's a scene which is like a kind of a magic realism in the film, which is going from a very realistic documentary kind of film to something that becomes almost dreamlike towards the end. And it was an important scene for me because it was the one I wrote first, which is odd for this movie when you see it. So it was kind of like, for me, the way I write is that I write random scenes which have nothing to do with each other, but just based on these characters, and somewhere try to connect the dots. I still haven't gotten over the 3-act structure problems that I have. I'm struggling.
I'm with you. That shit's hard.
It's hard. So this is like the connecting dots that I like to do, and I enjoy that very much. It's like, and there's so many scenes that you write that don't make it to the film, and they just like the juice of it all, and it's so fun. But this scene I had from the start, which was, where she sort of imagines her husband, and it was really important to me that because it's a story about a woman who is in a relationship, an arranged marriage with a guy who's vanished from her life, but that relationship is seen as something that is acceptable by society. And she really kind of looks down on her roommate who is having an affair with the person who, the society would never accept because of a difference in identity and religion. And she's like, this is not legitimate. This is not the right way to be. And so for me, this disappearing husband didn't really have to come back to tell her anything. She needed to sort of purge this morality out of her life. And in that sense, I connected a lot with Babygirl because, our codes of morality and sexuality and desire in different countries are different for women, but it's still the same fundamental struggle. And she needed to kind of, see the light in a world where it was all dark for her. Yeah. And that's also where the title comes from. And for me, this scene was difficult to do because it kind of is this, it could go either way. It could completely, because it slips into a kind of a fantasy world in a very realistic film. So I was very afraid of how to pull this off. And I relied a lot on sound design to do it, a kind of an internal sound design. And I enjoy that very much because cinema gives you those palettes the colors in your palette, and one of them is sound. And I think, for me, it was a tough scene to
the result was magical. I thought it was absolutely magical. That scene, so poetic and beautiful and very clear, also in that sense.
Of course,
very well done.
Yeah, Justin, from either of yours, was there one that was particularly daunting?
The ending of Challengers. Because I was pretty militant throughout the entire process of making the movie that we were never going to, and this is a spoiler, but that we were never going to declare a winner of the match. Because for me, by the time they arrive at that final scene, all their cards are out on the table, and they're having the most open and honest conversation of their lives all together, and they're having it through tennis. And they're all really playing tennis again for the first time in years, Tashi included. And so for me, the match doesn't matter anymore. The score doesn't matter. And I felt like declaring a winner would cheapen that. But of course, because it's a movie at the scale that it was made, there's pressure from various points to, this is a sports movie. We have to know who wins. If we don't say who wins, people are going to leave and give it a bad cinema score or something, And that pressure was real, and I respected it, and I got where it was coming from. But I was, really convinced that was not the path.
Right.
So in pre-production, I was finding ways to keep the fundamental truth of what I was going for in that ending, while also figuring out a way to make that to make it emotionally and sort of viscerally more satisfying and feel like something had been resolved. And that's when it sort of dawned on me one day in the production office that within tennis there was an answer, which was that in tennis sometimes the game itself actually brings the players closer together when there's a volley at the net. And that had not been in the script yet. This thing of them literally coming closer and closer together. And, if you think about tennis in relationship to boxing, those being the two sort of gladiatorial sports where it's one-on-one, boxing is all about touching another person, and tennis is all about not touching another person, which is why tennis is a game of repression, And so it felt all of a sudden like that could be a way to have our cake and eat it too, with the ending where finally they touch in the game.
That's great.
So yeah.
Thank you.
And huge cinema score.
Yes.
Most importantly.
And the cinema score went through the roof. I am now the president of cinema.
Halina, the scene for you?
For me, there's a scene in my movie where Harris Dickinson, who plays Samuel, her intern, and Nicole Kidman, who plays Romy, really have their first long meeting, and it's I call it the cheap hotel room. And the challenge of that whole scene is that for me, they go through a whole marriage within, let's say, 12 hours. And so they had to, be able to play all those different things, and we built it. It was a build set, and I wanted nobody in there except my DP, Jasper Wolf, who's a genius, and them, and we put microphones everywhere so that they could be completely alone. There's a lot of intimacy in that scene, but it's also technically just very hard to do, because what I was looking for is a tone where they kind of go in and out of their performance that sexuality sometimes is, because they're trying out their dynamic. So I wanted him to give her an assignment and then at the same time be like, oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. Is that okay? Am I allowed to say this? And that tone, I was like, how am I going to write that on the page so that an actor can read that and actually understands what, because that's quite hard. So I spent a long time writing it out so that hopefully the actors would understand. And then when we were doing it, it was the final day, and I was incredibly nervous. But they did such an amazing job, and we prepared it very, very intensely. So they knew all the choreography, and they were just amazing. So that in the moment, it could be electrifying, and they could even invent new stuff. And yeah, they're just amazing performers. But I was very nervous.
Wow. Jason.
I think is really important in my writing process, which is at some point in life as a writer, you feel something. You feel something, and it's really complicated. It's something that gives you joy, but heartbreak and loneliness and sadness, and it's like tasting something you've never tasted before. And as a writer, you go, how am I going to get an audience to feel that one day? And I think the technique that you build over the course of being a storyteller is figure out a way to get an audience to feel something really complex, and that's at the end of the day, like really all we're after. On SNL, there was this thing that I had experienced not only when I was on the floor of Saturday Night Live, what it felt like right before it went to air, which even as an audience member, you're scared. There's no good reason to be scared, but you are.
Right.
But I'd also felt it doing a high school play or like a summer camp musical, and it was how is the audience going to really understand not only that feeling, but how this whole group coalesces. And on our film on Saturday night, strange. It's not a movie with 90 scenes. It's a movie with one 90-minute scene.
Yeah.
The entire thing connects from the moment you meet Lauren all the way to the very end until someone says, live from New York, it's Saturday night. And we knew we were going to meet all these characters. And it became a question of having, oddly, two scripts. We have the script that is the script, the producible script, which is 100 pages that we actually numbered backwards. The first page was page 100, and then it went 99, 98, 97, all the way to the last page. But then there was a second document that had everything else, because we were going to be tracking 30 main characters, 80 speaking roles. We had days where our production mixer, Steve Morrow, had up to 58 mics going simultaneously. So many that he had to bring a second mixing board just to mix everything simultaneously. For us, the only way to actually get to know these characters and feel what it's like to really be there is for it to sound like you are really there.
Okay.
And that meant everyone needed dialogue, not just the people in the foreground, but there needed to be layers of dialogue as you moved through rooms so that you were tracking individual storylines even when you didn't think you were tracking them. And so the solution became, one, in our script, it's constant dual dialogue. That's when you have character dialogue left and right. And it's not because they're talking over each other. It's because these are simultaneous scenes that are happening, even though you were maybe hearing one versus the other. But then also having an additional document that had the storyline of every other character. Because in our film, we have to know not only where every person is at any given time, where every prop is at any given time, where every set piece, where the llama is, and we need to know where everything is in the building so that every time someone walks through a hallway, up a stairway, or get into an elevator, we can keep track of 5 different storylines simultaneously.
That's great.
So great.
Yeah.
So
Jim.
great.
Thanks, Jesse.
I don't know a scene, but the breakthrough I had, or the kind of moment I felt as a writer, I had figured something out, was very early starting it, which was Jay Cox had written a script already that had some great moments in it, but as I said, was kind of, and I think Jay had handcuffs on, he was avoiding kind of the stuff between the music. But in going after that stuff, I also realized that I didn't want to do, a long time ago, I co-wrote this movie called Girl Interrupted, and then there's this one scene where Angelina Jolie's character comes up to Winona Ryder and goes, talking about the therapy at the institution, she goes, did you cough up your secret? And Winona's character's like, what secret? And she goes, the one that you cough up and confess, and then they let you fucking out. And it's essentially my own reference to what I think of as the ordinary people or Good Will Hunting structure of movies, where you have someone harboring and burying, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's classic. I did it in Walk the Line, essentially. But you have this thing where, and then suddenly, somewhere in the third act, it comes out, and then they're, due to modern psychoanalytical theory, they're essentially healed or pass through to a new. And that I knew I couldn't do that for this movie to Bob Dylan. That there was nothing he was going to vomit in the third act that was going to suddenly make you go. So it was, in a way, similar to what he was just talking about in terms of Saturday Night, is that I realized, and I thought of my old mentor's movie Amadeus, Peter Schaefer's script and play, and how meticulously it's a movie about genius in which you don't penetrate the genius nearly as much as you understand Salieri, his wife, the king, and everyone else, and the wake they leave on others, which in its own way allows you to understand this other character, but you are not, you suddenly don't have to fulfill this other kind of Freudian scene that's such a staple, and a wonderful one that I enjoy of cinema, but that I knew would work in this particular script. If there's one other thing I could say about the quote you used before about movies need to, a script's job is to sell or to get made. Yeah. I didn't mean that in a cynical way. Yeah. I meant it in the sense that I was speaking to film students, and very often when you read young screenwriters' scripts, including my own, they are extremely aggressive in terms of trying to make sure you see the whole fucking movie. And oftentimes they're told not to do this because it'll offend the director, which is not the reason not to do it. The reason not to do it is it's fucking boring to read. And that a great, if we're talking about someone a screenwriter could take away, there was a great piece of advice I once received, which is to write a script like you're in a theater watching the movie, and speaking to a blind person who couldn't see it.
That's
So that, and if you took too long to describe what was going on, you get way fucking behind.
Yeah.
So you'd go, there's a lot of clouds in a little house. And that's all you say.
Right.
You don't go, it's a cupboard house with a peeling paint on the outside. Cumulonimbus are arriving. And then
That's so good.
You'd lose the fucking movie.
Yeah.
And then you just get out, a small house in a field.
Right.
And you try and write that way, and it gives you a sense of the impatience of your reader, who will stop reading after 10 pages of not, you bring all your intention, bring all the detail you see, but you can render that with less words and make the reading, because it isn't just a list of ingredients, it isn't just a list of dialogue, it is something that's going to have to win an actor. It's going to have to win a studio. It's going to have to win a crew, a DP, other people. They're going to have to decide to do your movie and not someone else's, so that you can't ignore that the document is not only a dramatic thing, but a persuasive argument for the existence of the dramatic thing at the same time. And that's what I meant.